Thank you all for being here. It's really cool to be with Adam back, especially a bit last minute. The first question is, maybe take us back. And what was the cypherpunk's early mission? And why were they building electronic cash?
Yeah, the cypherpunks were interested in re-establishing the rights of privacy and freedom of association that had been eroded by the advent of the internet. So in the physical world, you can spend cash in a shop, you can have a conversation, and nobody's spying on you. You know, you have a high degree of privacy. But as an accident of the rapid adoption of the internet in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, suddenly ISPs had logs, they had IP addresses, they had payment information. And so things that you would say could be recorded, and they could identify who said them. And so, the cypherpunks felt that you had some legal rights to expect privacy and to expect freedom of association, but they weren't being respected in the online world because law enforcement is, they're just doing their job and they're focused on the darker part of society, and so they will overreach. They'll ask for information they have no legal right to, and then if they become accustomed to that, they start lobbying for an increase in, like an erosion of privacy. So what we figured was, well, we'll just build the privacy, and it doesn't matter if they don't like it because we have a right to use it, or what society prefers to use is what law enforcement. Ultimately, society employs its government and employs its law enforcement. They're public servants. So what we want to do as a social norm is what should be the case. So we'll just build the technology and use it, and hope other people use it.
Were there legal challenges that came along with that ethos?
Yeah, so it wasn't without risk because the way that you would go about obtaining privacy was things like Tor and things that came before. So anonymous remailers were a kind of Tor for email. So, and it was a volunteer thing, right? So the remailers, of which there were maybe 30 to 50, were operated by volunteers, and people would email things through them or post them on discussion forums. And occasionally, if you were operating one of these, you'd get contacted by law enforcement or by military organizations and people that had evidently, you wouldn't necessarily know what they were complaining about, but they would be very, very angry. And there were some operators that actually got into some quite challenging legal hot water over that, and the EFF had to try and finance their legal defense, basically. So it was risky, and I was operating a remailer for a number of years. It was called the Swiss remailer. But I'd taken some defensive steps to put it further away from me. So I operated in another country, and I paid for it with cash in the post from a very small ISP by another cypherpunk. And eventually, the Swiss federal police turned up at his place of work. He worked at a big company. And they turned up and they demanded information about what had come through his server. And he said, well, I don't know, I'm a small ISP. There are some people who have accounts. I have no idea. And then he told me, and I switched it off. But that was my thought from the start, that I would just operate it until things got messy, and then I would shut it down. And they never bothered to because it's another country and so on, it was too messy, and they just dropped the investigation.
As a follow-up to that, do you see any parallels between that and today with Bitcoin, or do you think that we're about to enter that phase where it may become, at least for a period of time, a little scary to run Bitcoin infrastructure in some way?
I think Bitcoin probably got past that, some years ago, but certainly, when I got, actively involved, 2013, 2014, it was a lot more unclear how regulators would react. And some of the developers who are maintaining Bitcoin were a little worried about, using their real name, or the prospect of, getting legally attacked just as a software developer, volunteering on building the source code. Some people have, from time to time, have wondered about, whether law enforcement or regulators, I guess not law enforcement, might, try to infer that your action is a money transmitter or something, right, and that you needed a license. But generally, I think the regulations have come a lot further forward now. It's really more at the business level, about whether financial companies providing financial services around Bitcoin and how they should be regulated. That's more where the action is. But it's it's come surprisingly fast. Now you've got El Salvador with sovereign holdings of Bitcoin, public markets holding Bitcoin, big U.S. financial institutions and international institutions offering Bitcoin-related derivatives and Bitcoin custody and buying and selling to wealth management clients, and increasingly to regular clients. Somebody just sent me a screenshot of Revolut, which is a very popular kind of it gives you a debit card and a smartphone app. It's very popular in Europe as an online bank. They must have millions of users that they were reminding people that you could now deposit Bitcoin as well as withdraw it, and you could buy it in it. So clearly you're not going to get debanked for buying Bitcoin from the bank itself, right? So I think things have come forward a long way.
I don't want to hijack anything, so I'm...
One question I have is, because I kind of struggle with this, with privacy. I am on social media with my name. I have my writing platform. Sometimes I wish that I could go back in history and not be so open about who I am. Given that you started in the industry so early and that there's been claims that, you're Satoshi Nakamoto, is there ever, and I mean, you might be, but do you struggle with that as well, of wishing that maybe you had stayed private and not been open about who you are?
Yeah, I mean, the cypherpunks were developing privacy-related technology, and some of them were using it too. So there were some posters on the cypherpunks list who were posting anonymously just in general chit-chat or even some technical discussions, and there were a few software packages that were released by pseudonyms. So there was one electronic cash one called Magic Money by a pseudonym called Product Cipher with some zeros in the name, and that was actually quite similar. It's like a Chorm bank, but without any, it was pre-Bitcoin, so there was no way to take money in or out of it, but you could operate a Chorm bank with it, and you could exchange coins and stuff. And so there are a few bits of software like that, but yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people who were on that list were sort of aware of the risks of, being too public, to have your name associated with some of these discussions, even because there were legal risks around even encryption, right? Phil Zimmerman got in quite a lot of trouble for releasing PGP, which is an email encryption package, and was under investigation in the US for quite some years until finally that those regulations were changed. But for me, it was too late. I'd already participated using my real name on the mailing list, and at some point you've built up so many discussions that it's hard to it's too late, right? But I would say it's very interesting for Bitcoin that there be some anonymous contributors. Another thing about that backdrop, you can see that Phil Zimmerman got into legal difficulty. Some of the remailer operators did. Another example is eGold, which was a physical gold-based electronic cash system. It was a bit centralized and as a website, but you could pay users fractions of ounces of gold, and the founders and owners of it were resident in the US, and eventually they got into some legal trouble and ended up shutting down the company, refunding the money. And I think that caused legal problems for them for quite some years. So, for people who wonder why did Satoshi choose to be anonymous, I think you could probably look at some of those examples that had happened at that time to say, if you were somebody that was looking at that and seeing that other people who tried to do similar things got into legal trouble, and you'd seen other examples of people posting software anonymously, that being anonymous was a kind of superpower, right? It made it less likely that you would have these kind of problems. But anyway, for whatever reason, I think it's quite good for Bitcoin that we don't know who Satoshi was. To be clear, it's not me, categorically.
Are you sure?
But I think it's good for Bitcoin as a kind of discovery rather than a startup or an event, and that it sort of helps Bitcoin be considered as a commodity, rather than a technology startup or shares in a company. The way a lot of society thinks is very hierarchical, so they look for, the founder or the CEO or the politician in charge of something. So, I'm sure if he was identified, he would be, maybe asked to testify to, you know, a Congress in a country or something like that, right? Or put under political pressure to change something. And, you know, topically for Bitcoin's Genesis block quote and the time that at which it was released, you know, the Genesis quote, I presume most people know about it. Somebody's wearing a shirt saying the exact thing here, times Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks, right? So it's about moral hazard and the idea that banks can have a policy, or people can have a policy, society can have a policy, but if things get too dramatic and too economically challenging, there'll be enormous political pressure until some humans will, you know, violate the policy at the request of society. And so you don't want that with Bitcoin, because Bitcoin's a hard money. You want it to be like physical gold, where, you know, regardless of how short of money people are or how desperately they think the society needs a, you know, infusion of cash, you can't suddenly print more gold. You've got to mine it, or you've got to do some work, or you've got to sell something for it. And so for Bitcoin to have that property, it's very useful that it's decentralized and there's nowhere to make special pleadings for. And in fact, you know, you could view the block size wars back in the 2015 era as a form of that, right? A form where a number of startups were sort of trying to make the case that they really needed a quick fix, and they were willing to, like, you know, weaken the network, reduce its security to get it. And because it's decentralized and the market didn't want that, you know, I think that most of the people that were using or holding Bitcoin understood that well enough, but they rejected that, you know, and I think it was a kind of market rejection. So I think, you know, a lot of people who were looking at Bitcoin or joined Bitcoin since and saw that event took it to mean that, yes, you really can depend on Bitcoin being gold-like and retaining those properties, you know, indefinitely into the future.